We've talked about biblical data, and now what we want to talk about, what I've entitled this section, is one coming or many. One coming or many. For the fact is, and this was brought up last week in the question time, many people don't think of the second coming of Christ as a single event, which will come at the end of human history. Rather, they think that there are actually multiple returns of Christ, rather than a single return of Christ. And so today I want to look at two of these views that hold that there are actually multiple returns of Christ rather than one. And I'm going to argue that neither of these is a plausible interpretation of the biblical material. The first view I'm going to call the rapture view. According to this view of the rapture, there will be an invisible return of Christ to snatch away believers from the earth before the visible final return of Christ. Before the final visible return of Christ, there's going to be an invisible return of Christ to snatch away believers out of the world. Now, this is not a historic position of the Christian church. The Christian church historically has affirmed the unity of the second coming of Christ, that it will occur at the end of human history and will be a visible personal return of Christ. But in the 19th century, this rapture view, which was propounded by an Anglo-Irish evangelist named John Darby, became very popular in conservative Christian circles. So sometimes this view is called Darbyism, after John Darby. In 1827, he published a book espousing this viewpoint. This viewpoint then was picked up by the Scofield Reference Bible, which tended to popularize it then among fundamentalists and conservatives. And a number of institutions held to this point of view, principally Dallas Theological Seminary, a very prominent evangelical institution which is committed to this position. Also, popular writers have written books and novels espousing this view. One thinks, for example, of Hal Lindsey with his runaway bestsellers, Late Great Planet Earth and its sequels. And then also more recently, Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins with their Left Behind series. So this is a view that is very popular in evangelical circles, and I imagine for many of you, as for me, this was just the sort of view you unconsciously absorbed in the evangelical subculture. You just sort of grew up learning this view and have never really looked at it critically to see whether or not it bears out the biblical teaching of the New Testament. Now, you remember last week we read Jesus' end-time discourse called the Olivet Discourse, because he gave it as he sat on the Mount of Olives looking over at the temple, found in Mark chapter 13. So you may want to turn to that passage because we'll be referring to that a lot. And as you look at the Olivet Discourse, you would never imagine that there is going to be some sort of invisible return of Christ to snatch people out of the world. In Mark 13 and verse 19 and then 24 to 27, we read, Mark 13 verses 19 and 24 to 27, "For in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of creation, which God created until now, and never will be." And then verse 24, "But in those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven." Here it seems very clear that the tribulation will occur first, Christians will be not snatched away from it. There's nothing here to suggest that Christ is going to invisibly return and snatch them out of it. And then after the tribulation will come the visible second coming of Christ. So nobody, I think, reading Jesus' Olivet Discourse would ever think that somewhere along the line there's going to be some sort of invisible return of Jesus to snatch people out of the world. So where in the world does this idea come from? Well, the answer is it doesn't come from Jesus' teaching. It comes from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, which we also read and to which I'd like you to turn now. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 15 to 17, where Paul says, "For this we declare to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, shall not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the archangel's call, and with the sound of the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we shall always be with the Lord." And the proponents of this rapture view interpret this to be this rapture, this invisible return of Christ where he snatches believers out of the world. And then when Paul goes on in verse 1 of chapter 5, "But as to the times and the seasons, brethren, you have no need to have anything written to you," this then is describing the second coming of Christ, the visible return of Christ. So they divide or break up this passage in Thessalonians into the invisible rapture in chapter 4, which is then followed by the tribulation, and the visible return of Christ in chapter 5. So that's where the idea of the rapture comes from. Now, that's pretty slim exegetical basis. That's pretty much it, if you want to see a difference between the second coming of Christ and this rapture view. What can we say in response to this? Well, I think first of all, we have to say that there really are no grounds here for seeing a distinct event from the second coming of Christ. Certainly there's no hint at all, as we said in the Olivet Discourse, that there's going to be some sort of invisible return of Christ prior to his visible personal return at the end of the Great Tribulation. Now, proponents of the rapture view says, but look in 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 17, it says that we who are alive shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And this is referring to the rapture or the snatching out of the church. Well, the problem here with that interpretation of this verse is that the Greek word that is used here for meeting the Lord, apantesis, this Greek word is used in Greek literature to describe the people of a city going out of the city to greet an incoming dignitary or returning conqueror to welcome him back into the city. So that what this is describing here, it seems, is that the elect of God will be gathered to the Lord in the air to greet him and welcome him as he returns visibly to earth. In fact, this is the same event that seems to be described in Mark 13, verse 27.